Hello and welcome to this special online lecture titled A Tale of Two Trees, or How India Took to the Book. We are honored and privileged to have as our speaker for today Professor Abhijit Gupta from Department of English, Jadavpur University. Professor Gupta is a well-known scholar, and especially in the field of book history, which is an emerging discipline in the subcontinent, particularly in India. And he has introduced the field to young scholars like me and several others, and has showed us the way. He is preeminently the co-editor of a series of books on the field of book history in India, 4 books to be precise, which he has co-edited with Professor Swapan Chakravarti. And those books are Print Areas, Movable Types, Founds of Knowledge, and New Word Order. If I'm not mistaken, that's the latest in the series. And from what I guess, there'll be at least one more coming up in near future, which all of us have been eagerly waiting for a few years now. Professor Gupta has also translated a few texts such as Funny and Funnier, which is a translation of short stories by Shishendu Mukhopadhyay, and Tales of a Fantastic Family, which is a translation of Manoj Der Odbhut Bari, if that's what it's called in Bangla. So without further ado, I would once again like to thank and welcome Professor Gupta, who has found time for us. The presentation will be followed by question and answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Shashwata. Thank you for those very kind words. And just to let you know that we are indeed working on the 4th volume of Book History in India series, which hopefully we should be able to get out maybe by early next year. And with a working title of Pressing Matters, to continue with book-related puns in the title. So today, I am going to talk about two aspects of the early printed book in India. Now, of course, when you talk of India, it's a very capacious field in which to talk about. So, to be more precise, in eastern and northern India, I should think, and generally it's a story I'm going to tell, or part of a story, to do with the reception of the printed book in India. So, when I say that, the subtitle of my lecture, How India Took to the Book, is slightly erroneous. Of course, India had been familiar with many forms of the book before print, particularly the palm leaf manuscript or the birch bark manuscript. These were common currency in Indian letters and text production of texts. But of course, you know that with the coming of print, first the accidental coming of print to Goa in 1556 at the instance of Jesuits, and then about 2 centuries down the line, the more systematic introduction of print to India by the agency of the East India Company. You know that this is the period roughly from the 1750s onwards that print begins to become more general in India. But even then, it takes almost a century, more give or take, before print becomes pervasive. And so we're looking at various evolutionary stages in the history of print. And the phrase that some of you may be familiar with is socialization of text. That is to say, any new technology or the product of any new technology takes, there is a certain period which has to be given to it before it becomes socialized, before it becomes unremarkable. It is no longer an object of fascination or awe. So there is this sort of period in Indian print history where you see a gradual process by which print is introduced to first the metropolitan cities, and then the hinterland, what is known as the Mufassil. Now, of course, the narrative is always not so clear-cut. There are various. It's an uneven narrative, and it's not as if there's always this metropolitan village binary as well. So, for instance, you will know that when printing comes to eastern part of India, or what was then the Bengal Presidency, which of course comprised much of Odisha, Bihar, Assam, and all of modern day Bangladesh. When print first uh, um, uh, entered Bengal, the center was Calcutta, obviously. But in 1800, again completely accidentally, the town of Srirampur, which is about 40 kilometers from Calcutta, which was then a Danish enclave, became the accidental site of one of the most concerted exercise in printing through the agency of the Baptist missionaries. The Baptists play a very important role in this narrative because they published and they were very ambitious. Their 30 to 40 different languages over a period of 3 decades, and servicing a market which stretched from Afghanistan in the west to Borneo and Java in the east, or Malaysia. So the New Testament or the Old Testament Bibles and tracts in various languages, that this was their staple. Now, Srirampur again was a little town, and the reason why Baptists could print in Srirampur was because it was not British territory. The East India Company was very, very suspicious of missionary activity. Now, this is something which might appear strange, that we tend to think of the the colonial project and the missionary project as inseparable, but that was not so. And in fact, the story that I will tell about one of the trees and about one of the players in the story in fact illustrates this, that missionaries were barely tolerated by East India Company. Why? Very simple reason: because they sort of made trouble. They did not. They sometimes tried to stop the company from their unbridled looting and pillage that they carried out in the name of administration. And they also tried to convert soldiers who, of course, came from various religious denominations. So if you look at the composition of the British soldiery, you had European soldiers who were both Protestant and Roman Catholics. You had Indian soldiers as well, hailing with different faiths. So the last thing they wanted was for a Protestant missionary to go into army barracks or army cantonments and harangue their soldiers. So there were other problems as well. I mean, during the pre-Bentinck period, which is the legacy of Warren Hastings, the idea was that you would not interfere with the beliefs or customs of the indigenous population. So again, the missionaries were intervening in this sector. So that is why they were very, very suspicious of missionaries. After a point, about 1815 onwards, there is a degree of congruence between missionary and imperial enterprise. But the time we were talking about, they are not in lockstep. They are not on the same page. So, but the reason I allude to the missionary printing activity is to talk about one model of printing, and that is a missionary model. Now, if you're thinking of printing as a business, you buying and selling of books, then you're looking at a world of books which are bought and sold by way of trade. Now, and that is the form which we're most familiar with. I mean, the book as a commodity, the marketplace of books, books being bought and sold. But in the early years of print, buying and selling of books, or the commerce of books, was not well known. I mean, not at all a major sector of the book trade. I mean, the word trade, we cannot, in fact, even use the word trade. Let's talk about circulation of books. Books were mostly given away free. So the missionary model was raise money, crowdfund money from Europe or America. Tell your funders that you're going to use this money in translating and publishing the Bible in various South Asian languages, so that Christianity can be furthered. And you're giving these copies away free. And there were two categories of books, two categories of Christian publications: books and tracts. So books were the entire Bible, the Old Testament, the New Testament, or the Gospel according to Matthew, or the Mark, or Luke. But these were quite thick. And then there were tracts. Tracts were like 10, 12, 20 pages, maybe book of songs, book of hymns, or a conversation between a pandit and a missionary, stuff like that, which is illustrative of said, or a little tract on greed, on the 7 deadly sins, etc., etc. But the important point was that none of these were circulated by way of trade. They were all given out to anyone who would receive them. And that was the mission model till about the 1850s, when I think they belatedly realized that despite all this expenditure on translating Bibles or translating these books, producing them, giving them away, millions of copies, literally millions, the rate of conversions was very low. So people were taking the books, all right, but how many of them were reading it? What were they using the books for? Were they using the paper for various, recycling it for various purposes, repurposing paper? So we don't know about that. I mean, but it's obvious that not everyone who was receiving the tracts and the Bibles with such eagerness were doing so because they wanted to read it. There was a novelty value. You had a white man standing in a market or a school or near the river or at a fair, at a pilgrimage site, and talking in the language of the land, because most of the missionaries spoke the languages, so either in Bengali or Hindustani, which was the language, which was actually Urdu, Hindi, Odia, in the case of, think of the Reverend Amos Sutton, one of the first missionaries to work in, to produce the printed text in Odisha. And so the novelty value was immense. I mean, and, he was giving away the books, things free, so you took them. What happened to them, we do not know, and I suppose it's impossible. There's no archaeological tool that can unravel the story about what happened to these hundreds of thousands of books and tracts so willingly taken. This is one of the many models. So the missionary model was accounted for a very large percentage of the circulation and text, but there were also other models. There was local publishers. So if you think of in the 1820s and 30s in Bengali, the first Bhagavad Gita, the Srimad Bhagavat, all these were published in the form of print, or the Mahabharat subsequently. Though, of course, the missionaries also published Mahabharat. One of the most interesting, I think, bits of information is that, if this could be a good quiz question, who were the first to print Ramayana and the Mahabharata in India? I mean, of course, we know about manuscripts. And in fact, there were Christian missionaries. The Srinampur missionaries were the first to print the Ramayana and the Mahabharata in Bengali translation in 1802 and 3. That was the first ever printed version of Ramayana in any language. Now, when Hindu texts such as the Srimad Bhagavat or the various Puranas began to be printed, not written in manuscript form, there was an anxiety. Would the sacred text still continue to be sacred if it was done through an alien technology, if it was done by alien hands? There was fear. I mean, Shrapan Chakraborty, my colleague, has written about this in the first volume of Book History in India, about the fear and fascination simultaneously at this new technology, the fears of pollution, new material, new technology, and so on and forth. But what happened was the people who published these books or patronized or paid for the publication of the book, again gave them away free. The fact that you could buy or sell the Srimad Bhagavat was unthinkable. You were giving it away to either anyone who came to get them, or first to deserving people. Who were the deserving people? That the person himself would decide. Now, there's an interesting moment of transition which is happening here. When you are selling the book by way of trade, you have no control over who it goes to, right? Anyone who has money can buy it, and there you have absolutely no control over the readership. Now here you have a stage where a certain individual decides to print a religious text and then wishes to give it away free, but has control over who it is he is giving away to. So he can then, calibrate it according to caste, class, community, etc. But by the time in the mid-19th century, the great Mahabharata projects begin. So Mahabharata in Bengali in several volumes, first by financed by Kaliprashanna Singho, the great Bengali Renaissance humanist who died very young at the age in his 30s. Kali Singho's Mahabharata was given away free, not only that, to anyone who would ask for them. So there, the whole idea that you were controlling the distribution was no longer an issue. Anyone, and it was very clear, anyone, irrespective of caste, creed, or community, could claim those books. Likewise, when the Maharaja of Burdwan published a multi-volume Mahabharata, it was also given away free. The entire publishing, um, uh, uh, the produce of the Burdwan court was given away free. Likewise, the third Mahabharata as well, published by Pratap Chandra Roy. And no, I could give many instances of this. So this was another model. But the commercial model, that was late in coming. When, I mean, as I said, I don't mean late, but it took time to take shape. And there, this first of the two trees in my story. This tree gives its name to a locality in Calcutta, in North Calcutta, known as Bottola, under the bot tree, under the banyan tree. Bottola was a kind of a police station, a borough, which was known for its very famous old banyan tree, under which apparently, we don't know, the so-called founder of Calcutta, Job Chernock, would sit and sort of shoot the breeze, as it were, meet his friends. Now, under that, in that area, the Bottola area, as it was known, Borotola at that time, later the corruption of Borotola became Bottola, that place became one of the most energetic centers of print in South Asia between 1830s onwards. And Bottola printing, there's a lot of material on this. I'm not going to waste too much time talking about it. Bottola printing was about cheap print, but also anything that was that would be bought. It was completely commercial, unapologetically so. In fact, it sort of moved cheerfully between the sacred and the profane. So it would publish both religious texts as well as erotica, both beautifully bound 400 or 500 page textual productions, as well as horribly printed 20 pages of doggerel. Bottola cheerfully traded in everything. And it was like a kind of economic zone within itself, because all the personnel of the print trade, printers, booksellers, block makers, binders, coexisted in the same area, and continue to do this to this day. If you were to go to College Street and this environs, you would see that this sort of concentration of printing related professions. So you're actually looking at on the one, so first printing and then binding and then block making. These were in the letterpress age, these were the three divisions of labor. Paper usually came from outside. Paper was not manufactured here, but type foundries came from Howrah, which is nearby. So they were the foundries which produced the type and the paper came from all over India or even abroad. And once they reached Calcutta, once they reached Bottola, that is where the printing would happen, and then the illustrations and the binding. Now that, in a sense, we still follow that. That place is still carries out all these functions. And if one is to understand how the market of books worked, one has to look at Bottola. And people have done so in great detail. So that, in a sense, that tree is a symbol of one kind of printing, which is the commercial printing, the world of books circulated by way of trade. The interesting thing is that in the late 18th century, there was also commercial book market in Calcutta, but that was entirely controlled. The entrepreneurs were all Europeans, English or Europeans. And it was only in the early 19th century that the indigenous entrepreneur begins to come to the fore. And I should mention one individual who is, in a sense, emblematic of or anticipates a lot of evolutionary stages in the book trade, a man called Ganga Kishore Bhattacharya. Now, Ganga Kishore was from a village on the banks of the river Hooghly. Sometimes in the early years of the 19th century, maybe he heard that there was a place called Srirampur. There were missionaries producing books. We don't know how. Maybe he walked, maybe he took a boat. It's about 3 hours by National Highway 17. No, I've forgotten what the number is. So he went there. He learned printing from the Srirampur missionaries. He came to Calcutta in 1814 or 15, set up a book trade of his own, and he became the first Bengali who thought of making money from printing. And everything that he did was part of, he was, in a sense, it's almost like a discovery. that printing could make you money. He became quite rich. He allegedly, we don't know because there's no copies, published the first ever Bengali newspaper periodical in the 19th century, then went first ever Bengali periodical ever. Then went back to his village. He had a fight with his partner. He went back to his village, took his printing press with him, and continued to print from his village. And apparently became, I mean, you would think it would be impossible to run a business from a remote village in 1820. We are talking about 200 years from now. But apparently he was doing quite well. I mean, you'd think, okay, how did he get paper? What was the route? I mean, there were no railways. How did he even take his press there? Okay, maybe bullock cart, maybe waterways on a boat. How did he get his press furniture? Where did he get his bind? Who did the binding? These are questions we have to ask whenever we think of books and reading. But apparently he solved these problems. And then you have to ask, how did he sell these books? He was in some remote village somewhere, and apparently he had agents who took books from village to village. Again, we know nothing about this process, but it's, in essence, he's sort of his career starting in a village, then going to Srirampur, then coming to Calcutta, then going back to a village. These three journeys anticipate the history of the printed book in Bengal. I mean, that is how it happened. First missionaries, then the imperial city of Calcutta, and then the villages or the mafasil. So if you're looking at three stages, you're looking at the missionary stage in printing, then you're looking at indigenous entrepreneurship in the city, then you're looking at entrepreneurship outside the city. So the book begins to penetrate into the hinterland. So the spread of print, you can see a kind of a diagram, a kind of a cartography or map of how print spreads and the different agents who are responsible for the spreading of it. There are other models. I've spoken of two models: the mission model, the patronage model, the commercial model. Then there are other book models, such as we are printing for polite societies like Societies of Letters, Calcutta School Book Society, Vernacular Literature Society. These are usually producing books for the education market, small and big societies. Then you have the humanist printers, those who are reformers and have enough money to set up their own printing presses at a loss, starting with Raja Ram Mohan Roy, Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar, Bankim Chandra Chatterjee. All of them had their own printing presses. They were all publishers. Now, they didn't need to make a profit because they were quite rich, but they were doing so. Most of their publishing was in the periodicals and the newspaper sector, because that is how they thought they could mold public opinion. They could start or inaugurate a public sphere. Authorship of books was more of a individual thing. You are an author. But in periodicals and newspapers, it is possible to create or at least hear the voice of the people. So from the 1840s onwards, you see an explosion of periodicals all across Greater Bengal, starting from Calcutta, spreading into the Mafasil, spreading into places like Burdwan, Chinsura, Hooghly, Murshidabad, the princely city, then to places like Shivsagar in Assam, Cuttack in Orissa, so the newspapers like the Utpal Deepika, etc. So there is a very clear picture of how these kind of what I would call public spheres took place, and how certain idealistic humanist printers, sometimes, and even in certain cases, they were not even rich. They were very poor, reformist humanist printers. So you think of the great Odia humanist Fakir Mohan Senapati and the printing at Balasore. If you look at the history of that, Jatin Nayak has written about that. And it follows a very familiar pattern of print humanism. So when we look at the coming of print, as I said, or India taking to the book, we should be alert to look at these models. And the first question we have to ask is, where is the money coming from? You see, all of these questions can be answered if you can identify the source of capital. Everything needs money. Where is the venture capital coming from? So for instance, the missionary press needs money, so that's crowdfunding. If you're going to publish the Mahabharata, that needs money, so that's being provided by Maharajas and philanthropists. You need to print cheap books. You don't need that much money. Ordinary entrepreneur could do it. So you're looking at various models of financial models, and the size of the book, the production cost of the book can tell you about the kind of capital which was in flow, or where the money was coming from. And access to money also is, in a sense, makes modernization possible. If you don't have floating capital, you cannot modernize your printing press, you cannot modernize your binding, you cannot have good paper. So all of these are linked. So as in any other activity, you have to ask first, what is the source of capital? What is the source of money? How is it sustained? And this is a particularly important question for periodicals, because periodicals come in they're you start a periodical, you sell some copies, you get some subscribers, then gradually it dies out because people are not paying anymore. The high mortality and morbidity rate of newspapers and periodicals in any part of the world is because of this reason, that it is started with a small amount of capital, but it's very difficult to sustain. Sustainability is the key. You need deep pockets in order to sustain, or you have to suffer losses yourself. So in a sense, it's possible to look at the entire world of books through the lens of capital that is available or not available, or economic financial models. But that's a kind of large, sort of structure that I'm proposing. I mean, within this, there are other kinds of models as well. There's printing by contract, so you get a government contract, you print for government, etc. But I'm talking about very broad categories. So crowdfunding, philanthropy, commercial publishing on contract. These are the ways in which the printed book becomes more general, more common in all of us. But I understand that you are familiar with one of my essays, which is called What Really Happened Under a Tree Near Delhi in May 1817. Now that's pretty early, May 1817, that's still early years. And what tree is it? I mean, why is there a tree in the middle of all this? That is a story which I've told, and I can revisit that in a slightly different way. In that, that the said tree, just outside Delhi, in a village called Topi, first made an appearance in a very famous essay by Homi Bhabha called "Signs Taken for Wonders," which appeared in the 1980s and became one of the most seminal essays in post-colonial historiography. And it talks about a chance encounter between a man called Anand Masi, an Indian catechist, Indian Christian, and a group of villagers who were sitting outside the tree, outside Delhi, under a tree, May 1817. It must have been very, very hot. May in Delhi, North Indian plain, no child's play to be out in the open. And they had copies of an English book with them. Now, that is the term that Bhabha uses, an English book. Of course, it was not an English book. It was the Bible, New Testament, either in Hindustani or Punjabi. We are not entirely sure. And he was very surprised that, what are they doing with copies of the Bible? And he engages them in conversation. And from that, about baptism, about sacrament, it's a remarkable conversation, as reported by Bhabha. And from that, he draws certain conclusions about this encounter between the English book and an Indian readership. But it's also, though it's a very influential essay, it also historically it is kind of, he's not very interested in the history of. He asks, what about the book? Who can tell? He says, what about the people? Who knows? A kind of a rhetorical device. But if you're interested in material histories, you would like to know who are these people? Why were they sitting behind a tree, under a tree in the heat of the Delhi summer? What were they doing? So gradually, and now because it's easier to piece together these stories thanks to, you can now look at sources from the 19th century through Google Books to various digitization projects. You don't really have to travel that far to libraries. So it's easier now to piece together these stories, and also the archives of the Baptist missionaries are available. So So what was the story that emerged? The story that emerged was that from 1801 onwards, the missionaries in Srirampur, there were three of them who were very famous: William Carey, Joshua Marshman, and William Ward. They were known as the Srirampur Trio. And they were a bunch of extraordinary people. Ward was a printer, but both Carey and Marshman were fantastic scholars. I mean, they learnt languages, taught themselves languages, wrote the dictionaries and grammars, translated various parts of the New Testament, Old Testament, etc. in that language. Now, obviously, you can't. Not all of them are completely accurate. I mean, you can't learn languages like that. But they were very, very, very good at what they did. Also, they were, and one of the sidelights is that, and they were also very interested in Indian literature, Ramayana, Mahabharata, etc. Though this was frowned upon by their superiors in London. They said, why are you wasting our time doing this? Because we're supposed to be doing the Christian word, not supposed to be interested in local literatures. But they were interested, of course, because anyway, that's a different thing. And they were very ambitious. They wanted to spread the word of God all over India, the Christian God. But the company held them back. Said, no, you can't go. But when useful for them, the company also led them. So, for instance, when the East India Company set up a college called Fort William College in Calcutta in 1800, why did they set up the college? To train the future cadre of the British Raj. So, administrators would be trained in the college so that they could rule India. Now, obviously, you need college textbooks. You need departments of language. So, you need departments like Persian, departments like Bengali, Hindi. And as the British Empire expanded, the need for new departments arose. So after the Second Anglo-Maratha War of 1805 and 6, the Marathi dictionary, the Marathi Bible begins to appear, because now there's a Marathi department. You need to send people to Maharashtra, well, that was not called Maharashtra at that time, in order to rule that place. When the company traveled into Odisha, the Odia New Testament and Bible began to be written. So the Fort William College, the departments were kind of a mirror of the colonial project. And there they needed the missionaries. Who would teach them? Who would write these books? And thus the missionaries went. Carey was himself head of the department of both Sanskrit and Bengali. So for a period, there was a kind of common ground between the missionary and the company. So, but this was, as I said, a kind of a fraught relationship. And then round about this time, you see, a lot of people also came from Europe, particularly England, to Srirampur, to the mission field, because they wanted to work in the mission field. They were interested. They were, they were part of the order, and they arrived on the doorstep of Carey, said, "Give me work." In a way in which NGOs nowadays work. And often there was a kind of conflict between, a new person would come, they would have to find work for that person, and they would have to be amenable to mission discipline. It's a very strict discipline that if you do what you're told. Now, some of these people who were young, they also had kind of ideas of their own. So they not always get along very well. So this man who I'm going to talk about, a man called Chamberlain, John Chamberlain, was one such. I mean, he was very difficult to discipline, and he was completely undiplomatic. He would go and create trouble everywhere, try to preach among soldiers, and every time that happened, and he was deported twice, once from Behrampur, once from Agra. He had been arrested and sent back to Calcutta. Just get rid of this troublesome person because he's going and bothering soldiers. So the company, and every time he would do that, Carey and would get even more irritated with him. He said, why are you doing this? But Chamberlain was also very gifted. He's gifted in two ways. He was very good with languages. He had a very good singing voice. Now again, very few people have worked on this. The connection between mission work and singing of hymns. You needed to be able to, when you're sort of looking at a new group of new congregation who may be neo-literate or not lettered at all, you have to perform, you have to preach, you have to sing. Anyone with a good singing voice or to be able to play musical instruments was an asset, and Chamberlain was that. But Chamberlain also had a very unfortunate life. 3 of his daughters died when he was in India, etc., etc. And so he would usually be sent away from the mission, to go to Katwa, go to Digha, go to Gangasagar, go to Agra, go to this place. So he was constantly on the road, on the move. But as he went, he carried with him a supply of Bibles. Everywhere he'd go, he would be distributing them. So we are getting through Chamberlain's journals, which are available, this extraordinary picture of how books are literally, you can actually see it in front of your eyes. So for example, let me give you one or two entries from his diary, from his journal. So just give me a second. Let me open this file. So in one place, he says, he's going by river. Okay, again, before railways, right? So 1811, he's sailing in a boat with one man called Mr. Peacock, who is apparently an alcoholic. So he's writing, on the Ganges near Patna, February 28th, 1811, he writes, we are now advancing into Hindustan, where I find the language prevailing in some respects very strange to me. And then he writes 2 weeks later, it's not some days earlier, the language called by Europeans Hindustani and the language of the Hindus are diverse. The later is Hindvi or Hindi. The Hindustani, which is spoken by the Muslims, is a compound of the Hindi, Persian, and Persic and Arabic. It is much spoken as a popular tongue. So he says that we must have the scriptures in that language too. So as Chamberlain traveled along the great Gangetic plain, he distributed tracts everywhere. In a place called Bhagwan Gola, he wrote, 4th February, 200 scriptures, tracts, and about 1 testament. Then he goes to Munger, near Pune and Bihar, with now Mongir, that at that time known as Mongir. Upwards of 30 books and 100 tracts were given away. In April, he finds himself in Allahabad, where he stood by the side of the river, preached to hundreds of people, giving away tracts and parts of the New Testament. Next morning, he writes, 3 Sanskrit New Testaments and considerably more than 50 parts of the New Testament were sent abroad, and some hundreds of tracts. By the time the group had reached Agra, he had obviously finished all his books, and he writes to Srirampur, I hope you will send me the remainder of the Hindustani New Testament, and if you could get a few more of the Persian Gospels, they would be very acceptable, as the Muslims and many Hindus read nothing but Persian. So it's a multilingual project that is going on, translation project, Persian, Hindustani or Urdu, Sanskrit, etc. So in 1813 again, he's sent up to, this he does in 1811. Then he goes to Agra and gets into trouble. Then in 1812, so he's sort of arrested and sent back to Bengal. In 1812, he's again ordered to go to North India, and this time to a place called Sirdhana, Sirdhana, which was the seat of Her Highness the Begum Samru. The Begum Samru was an ally of the British. Formerly, she had been a dancing girl. Then she had married a European mercenary, a Roman Catholic mercenary called Walter Reinhardt. And then she had become a Roman Catholic herself. Now she wanted a chaplain or a churchman in her court. And so in 1813, again in the heat of summer, May 1813, Chamberlain goes first by river, then by horse, then by elephant, then by buggy, and then by palanquin, and finally reaches Sirdhana on 8th May 1813. In a letter dated the following day, Chamberlain wrote, it is a painful circumstance that I have not a single copy of the scriptures in any language of the country to present to Her Highness. Nothing would have pleased her more than a copy of Sebastiani's Gospels in Persian, so the Begum Samru could read Persian. Mr. Martin's Gospel of St. Matthew. Who was Mr. Martin? Mr. Martin was Henry Martin, the first translator of the New Testament into Persian. So he says that I shall want as many of Martin's Gospels and Sebastiani's and 5 more Arabic Bibles, 40 or 50 more of your Hindi Gospels. So he's sort of hanging around northern India and obviously wanting to translate because he was good at languages, but he needs a collaborator. You can't do this alone. And he also has now come across this new language called Braj Bhasha. And he also wants to translate the Bible into Braj Bhasha. But again, there's a limit to how many languages man can work in. And Chamberlain was learning these languages, but he was also looking for an assistant. And then suddenly this young man called Parmanand appears on his doorstep from Delhi. And it's a strange story. Now, look, I mean, we don't entirely know how true these stories are because they are what we know about them are from missionary accounts. So again, I mean, there is a filter there. We have to take this with a bitch of 10% or whatever, 20% of skepticism, because it is written to, in a sense, glorify the missionary project. But Parmanand seems, the backstory of Parmanand is that he was from Delhi, he was a Brahmin, he was a priest, but he was not pleased with any of the religions, so he begins to do a study in comparative religions. His conscience was, and there's a long passage. He goes and tries to learn the religion of the Sahib Log, and he thought that it would be easy to disprove it, because then it will be my duty to convince them of error. But then he's unable to do this, and then he becomes more and more despondent. And he talks about he studies all kinds of religions. He studies Islam. He reads all the holy books. He goes on pilgrimages, etc. But nonetheless, he is not happy. Eventually, he finds that he hears about a Mr. C, this Chamberlain, who has, and he received some Devanagari translation, Hindi translation of St. Matthew. And then he heard that this man, Chamberlain, was looking for someone to work with him. So so they begin to work together from June 1813. In June 1813, on the 5th June, Chamberlain in his diary writes, "I have met with an excellent writer. He seems to wish for instruction, pleases himself with the idea of becoming Christian," and they seem to have become very, very close. They were Parmanand taught Chamberlain for 6 months, and then they begin to translate the Hindustani, the Bible, which was written in Hindustani, from the Hindustani into the Brij Bhasha. So he said, which is the radical language of Hindustan, which is without any mixture of Persian and Arabic. October 1813, Chamberlain writes, "Parmanand affords much pleasure and hope. He's a very diligent young man." Next, January 1814, Parmanand, he stayed in the evening till 9 and 10 o'clock, wrote off from my mouth the 8th and part of 9th chapters of the Revelations. The next 18 months, these two men worked together, translating the Pentateuch, the first five main books of the Bible, and the New Testament into Braj Bhasha. And there are many other accounts of Parmanand, sort of all across northern India, Meerut, and so on and so forth. But the high point of this whole story is April 1814. Now, that was the year of the Kumbh Mela. Not a Purna Kumbh, but an Ardh Kumbh. As you know, Ardh Kumbh takes place every 6 years or so. The Kumbh, the Purna Kumbh Mela is every 12 years. The Ardh Kumbh Mela is every 6 years. And normal Kumbh Mela is 3 years, as far as I know. It may be slightly wrong. Now, Chamberlain goes to one of the Ardh Kumbh Melas, which is the 1814 Mela, in April 1814. And once he comes back, he writes this sort of very vivid account, and he writes that it is a week since I returned home from Haridwar, where we remained 14 days, 12 of which I was busily engaged in preaching salvation by Jesus Christ. I took all the books I had for distribution, but amongst the immense multitude assembled there, all were very few indeed. 10 times the number might have been sent abroad with ease. For days, we had but one Gospel of Matthew in Hindi, not one in Bengali. It was astonishing to see the multitude of the Sikhs. They literally overwhelmed the people of Hindustan, and it was very pleasing to find so many of them that could read. Of course, this was to be expected. The Sikhism was a religion of the book, the Guru Granth Sahib, and most of the Sikhs who were there could read. One Raja came with 30,000 followers when we had not a book to give them. The assembly was immensely large this year. Probably 10 lakhs of people were there. Every evening, I was surrounded with a very large congregation, to which I preached till dusk, from the beginning to the ending, 2 or 3 hours. Sometimes the congregation was surrounded by 5 or 6 elephants, on which there were many Europeans who had come to hear from the novelty of the matter. I preached in the Hindi, which all appeared to understand, both Bengalis and Hindustanis. I found it difficult to understand the Sikhs, but I believe I should be able, in a short period, to preach to them in their own language, were I to be called to it. Had I had some Pashto and Persian Gospels, I should have been able to send some into Persia and Kandahar. So you're really looking at the Kumbh Mela as a kind of a focal point where all, and it's indeed a focal point for pilgrimages, and people from all parts of India have congregated there, both from the east, west, north, and south. So people as far as from Kandahar, um, and of course the Sikhs, and in the heart of this, and everyone is doing their own religious, carrying out their activities. Now this is 1814. 3 years later, or 2.5 years later, in May 1817, a bunch of strangers appear under a tree outside Delhi with some of these books they said that they had got at the Hardwar fair. This is where our story begins to differ from the story which is told by Bhava. Because in their encounter, they said that we had got these books from the Mela in Hardwar. So they had gone to the Kumbh Mela. They had got these books. But which copies did they have? So that is the first question that historian is asking them. Who were these people? What language were they familiar with? What Bibles were they carrying? And why were they carrying them? I mean, you don't go out suddenly carrying Bibles in your hand and what in a hot summer day. Now, the link between these two, the 1814 Mela and the 1817 encounter, is the figure of Parmanand. Because Parmanand subsequently becomes so. I mean, I have written that the Bibles could either be the Hindustani translation of the scriptures, which is Urdu, or the New Testament in Punjabi, printed in 1811, because he talks about the multitude of Sikhs. Now, Chamberlain then leaves. So Parmanand then passes under Reverend Thompson, who came to Meerut in February 1815, and now he wants to be baptized. Now he wants to become a Christian. On the other hand, it is a very difficult step for him to take. It's a very lonely step for him to take, because he would not be part of his society anymore. Even his wife and children, they would not. They were not able to persuade his wife to convert, and he sort of became depressed and said, "No one seemed to care for my soul." And then he heard about the Sikh faith, and he seemed that he found the Sikh faith, the Sikhism, the monotheism of Sikhism. He found that praiseworthy, and he said that they have taken some of these books and the 500 testaments, and at one point 500 testaments distributed by some missionaries, sometimes since are now eagerly read, and they seem to be preparing their minds for greater things. Now, in Christmas 1816, Parmanand is finally baptized by the Reverend Fisher, and the stage is now set for one of the most dramatic encounters in the history of Christianity in India, May 1817. How do we know of this? The first account of this encounter very likely came out in the Missionary Register of 1818, which came out from London. According to a report in that periodical, on 6th May 1817, the Reverend Fisher, now after Parmanand became Christian, he became known as Anand Masi. So they retained the last part of him, Anand and Anand Masi. So Reverend Fisher wrote a letter to the Reverend Thompson. First, he described Anand Masi's trip to Delhi to see his wife. Then, while in Delhi, he heard that some villagers had congregated under a tree. 500 people reading some books. Now, in his essay, Bhabha, who's also looking at this same source, quotes from Fisher's lengthy letter to set the scene for an exchange in which Anand, he tells the villagers that, why don't you baptize and take sacrament, but they sort of keep him away. But the problem is that, if you look at Bhabha's essay, it's like one paragraph. He gives this account. But actually, in reality, they are two different accounts. One, separated by nearly a week in time. He goes there twice. Or he meets with these people twice. Anand Masi first goes and meets the villagers. The villagers say that we have to go home. Our thing is done. And we may return next year. The rest of the extract which Bhabha quotes is actually a letter from a week later written by Anand himself after he visited their village. So he became interested and went to their village. So actually there are two accounts. One is the first encounter under a tree. The second is 1 week later, Anand Masi goes to their village and writes more. Now, these two have been compounded by Bhabha as one narrative, number one. And there, in the second encounter, he just meets 20 or 30 people, not 500 people. And he says that I arrived among those people, but did not meet with the whole of them, because that principle is scattered in different directions. So all the number of villagers from different villages are gathered in one place outside Delhi. They had gone back to the village and they had gone back to their respective villages. Now, again, Baba quotes this, but what he does not tell us is that these are actually Anand's own. It's a first-person account. So, very often we hear about how the voice of the colonial subject or the voice of the subaltern is never heard. But even in a case such as this, of course, with the caveat that this is a missionary report. The missionaries are reporting that this is a letter written by Anand, so it's translating them. But here is a case, if we believe the missionary account, because the rest of the information is taken from missionary account. So if we believe the missionary account, then here is actually Anand himself writing 2 letters, speaking in his own voice. Now, why do you suppress that voice? At no point in Baba, as I said, does he say that this is actually the voice of Paramanand himself. He sort of quotes it selectively as if it's a third-person account. It's not. It is the first-person account. It is the colonial subject speaking. So there are these two problems. First, the first is the collapsing of 2 narratives set apart in time into one narrative, and then suppressing the fact that this was actually Paramanand himself or Anand Masi himself reporting on the villagers. And he says about, and he writes that apparently it was their practice, these people, I'm still saying these people because at this point we still do not know who these people are, to establish a party of their own, choosing 4 or 5 who could read the best to be public teachers from the newly acquired book. The numbers daily and rapidly increased, especially among the poor, and which at last suggested the idea of convoking a public meeting for all their associates. The large grove of trees near Delhi seemed a convenient spot, but were they actually sitting under the tree to have a reading circle, to just read a book? Another account, a week later, Anand writes, one of the villages which I visited on my route belonged to the king of Delhi. A dispute having arisen about some money payments, the king's people killed 3 of the villagers and wounded 7. So there was a fight going on. So they came to complain. Notwithstanding, the villagers did not kill any of their men, king's men, but having brought their dead, came to the Delhi resident, Mr. MacDonald, to complain. Lieutenant MacDonald. And in July 1817, Lieutenant MacDonald writes, several of these people came to Delhi in the course of the last month for the purpose of laying a complaint before the resident, respecting some acts of oppression under which they were suffering. So they actually came to make a complaint. Anand Mase brought them to us. But at first, their minds were so full of grievances, at first they would speak of nothing else. So that was the main grievance, that people, the kings, the rajas, soldiers are killing our people. It's only later when Anand Masi prods them, they talk about the Bible that they have. So Anand Masi is bringing them to a European official full of expectation that this is a group of native people who can become Christians, but they are not interested in questions of religion. They are going to make a civic complaint about king's oppression. And when pressed, they say, yes, of course, we are also interested in the Bible. And subsequently, the missionary communication, the letters, they became much more enthusiastic about this miraculous acceptance. And in fact, one of them writes that, we have asked Anand to be less, not to get carried away, not to exaggerate things. Now, who are the people? Now, again, you will see that Baba is not interested in this question. Who are they? Who can tell? Because he wants them to, their role in this essay by Baba is are passive players of mimicry. You see, the 2 terms, the Baba uses the term hybrid and mimicry very often, that we are constantly mimicking our. So they are the classic mimic candidates for mimicry. They're a passive receiver of influence and they're going to mimic them. But in 1818, we find another letter. It appears that these poor strangers are called Sadhs, S-A-A-D-H-S, Sadh. They are a distinct sect about 50-60 years ago when they separated themselves from the authority and control of the Brahmins. So they're a breakaway Hindu sect who both in temporal and spiritual things. They are mainly to be found in the Farakabad and Mirzapur, and 5 villages in which the sadhs are to be found. And about Rahut contains 150 people which possesses 10 Gospels of St. Matthew, while the other 4 smaller villages are 1 Matthew and 1 Mark. So these people are all gone to the Kumbh Mela and brought back about a dozen books with them. And they are able to read the Nagri script. So that is their ability. Now, the Sadh sect was founded 160 years ago by a man called Jogi Das, who was wounded in battle, thought he was dead, and was miraculously recalled to life by a holy man. This miracle led Jogi Das to become the preceptor of the new faith. And in the Doab region of North India, he had a number of disciples. Which was, again, it was a kind of a very monotheistic sect without any kind of ostentatious rituals and so on and forth. And they utterly exclude from their religion system all Hindu deities. They consider pilgrimage as folly. For divine worship, they have no temple but a hut called the Jamla Ghar, usually situated in the village. And every full moon, they would have a meeting at the Jamla Ghar where they would offer flour, ghee, milk, or sugar. There would be monthly meetings and a general annual assembly in the month of March, the spot determined by local convenience. Last year, it took place at Delhi at the time when Anand met with them in Topi. So, and they had very little idea about the Christian book. Anand, when he met them, tried to give them an explanation. And there was a school which was opened in a place called Kawali, one of the Sadh villages. And Anand was put in charge by the missionaries, but he was also warned, as Anand has been repeatedly cautioned, not to let his warm imagination delude him into any exaggerated representations of what he may deem worth observing and communicating. So, and these sadhs became very interested to, for example, Indologists. So in 1832, there's an article by the Indologist Horace Wilson, where he talks about the hukums of the sadh. They had a kind of a system of commandments, or Adi Upades. That is the kind of, and they were also affiliated to Guru Nanak and Kabir at the same time. So this was a kind of a very interesting sect. I mean, I don't know much more about this. I mean, you can find out yourself if, But this was the group of people who were sitting below the tree, meeting in one of the yearly concourses, but carrying the books with them. And this is into which Anand Masi enters. So the questions we are asking, as I suppose as historians, book historians, are these. What book? Why these people? Where did they get the book from? What did they make of it? What is the role of Anand Masi? How much do we believe the story that Masi tells? Because, as you can see, in 1817, everyone is writing about them. In 1818, his mentors are telling them, don't let your imagination run away with you. So they have obviously figured out that this is not such a dramatic thing as it was. Anand portrayed it as something which was extraordinary. But in truth, this was not the case. Therefore, we have to ask this. I mean, what Bhava describes in his essay, he sort of uses this as an encounter between English book. Now, of course, this is not an English book, as we have seen. Of course, if you say that it's produced by the English, that's a different thing. He talks about mimicry, sly passivity. But none of these really answer our question. None of these do justice to this. The inquisitive nature of the sadhs, who are themselves very interesting because of the kind of religious minority that they were, the kind of rejection of mainstream Hinduism that they performed, and the little kind of monotheistic sect that they created, their own practices of worship, little borrowings from Sikhism. All this make them people with a great deal of agency. They're not passive. They are intelligent. They are careful readers of books. They know the value of the book. And for them, the Christian book that fell into their hands was a gift, which was accepted in that spirit, in a spirit of accommodation, in a spirit of tolerance. Not the triumphalist language of religious conversion. The Anand Masi is as a Christian catechist and as a newly minted Christian. His narrative spin was that how does one religion prevail over the other? How can I convince the villagers to embrace Christianity? Whereas here, the villagers are talking about a much more capacious worldview. They are comfortable in a world where they have their own faith, which is the Adi Upadesh, that of Jogi Das, but they're also comfortable holding the Christian book in their hands and talking about it. And in a sense, people such as these constantly were part of the reason why the missionary project did not succeed very well in India at the beginning of the 19th century. That, the idea was that if you had the Bibles in Indian languages, if you distributed them far and wide, then the word of God would automatically follow. It is not as simple as that. And the Sads, those people, therefore, deserve much more attention than has been given in Bhaba's essay. They are not passive agents. They are, in fact, remarkably interesting and accommodating readers or early users of a book. They're, taking to the book, Christian book, becomes one of the most interesting episodes of give and take. Anand himself came to a rather unfortunate end. He, towards the end of his essay, Bhaba asks, "And what of the native discourse? Who can tell? And what is the significance of the Bible? Who knows?" We do know. And the Anand Masi, what about him? In words of Bhaba, Anand Masi's lifeless repetition of chapter and verse, his artless technique of translation, participate in one of the most artful technologies of colonial power. Yes and no. Anand is not artless, he is artful. Remember that years before that he was Parmanand, he was constantly struggling to make a name, career advancement in the Christian establishment. Once he's baptized, he is and he's adapting, mutating, translating, maybe mistranslating things which are crafted for missionary years. So he goes to a bunch of people, there is one narrative, then he goes and tells something else, which is, again, between that and the truth, there is a gap. Were the words ascribed to the villagers under the tree actually spoken by them? Or were they, in fact, Anand Masi's own, strategically crafted for missionary years? I said he came to a sad end. In 1857, when the first War of Independence, the Sepoy uprising was flamed all across northern India, Anand Masi changed shape for the last time. He donned the saffron garments of a Bairagi, but he was slaughtered. So this is one story among many stories which could be told about the spread of print, about how people took to print. Now, we don't have too many of these stories. These are stories of encounters between a group of people who now we can identify such villagers. We don't know about the other encounters. We don't know what happened to the books which were given away free by the ghat, by the river, in the school, in the marketplace, etc. But when we do know a bit about them, it is our duty to be as diligent as we can in finding out the material history of this. What exactly happened? That is an important question. We cannot overascribe it with our theoretical imperatives and fit our narrative to a kind of theoretical model that we have. So subsequently, if you look at missionary archives, you'll come across many such encounters of people. For example, near Jessore in Bangladesh, there's a sect called Satya Guru, who in the 1830s were found cherishing or sort of worshipping a book of William Carey's 1801 Bengali New Testament. Who knows how did it get there? Then they talk about the coming of a person called Satya Guru, not Jesus, but Satya Guru, a kind of a hybrid between Christianity and Hinduism. So the most fertile, the most interesting narratives are to be found in these intersectional points of intersection between various faiths in India and various kinds of reading, various expectations from And we're talking about the sacred book, right? I'm not talking about the book, the other tree, which is in Bottola, which is completely different in nature. Here we're looking at how India took to the book through sacred reading, which is, of course, one of the major kinds of reading in India. Reading for piety, be it oral or be it, you know, scribal, be it the recitation of mantras and a hymn, or be it the silent reading of a particular religious text. These are all both traditional and modern consumptions of the textual word. I think I've spent about an hour, and maybe I should stop here and invite comments or disagreements or questions if there are any. If that's all right, Shashwatal. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you so much, sir, for that richly insightful and comprehensive lecture, which I'm sure must have introduced the subject of book history to our young students in a way that I'm sure they would not have imagined. And this is something we do in the classroom, but of course, nothing like the way you have presented it to us today, the various layers, and also very importantly, it tells us to approach literature as a discipline outside the influence of theory, to go into um, the solid material history, as you pointed out. So thank you so much, sir, for your talk. I think we have a couple of questions. Should we go ahead with the questions?
Yes, yes, of
Okay.
course. There are.
Okay. Okay. So the first question is by Shikha. I'll just read it out. Thanks for this very comprehensive lecture, Professor Gupta. What really brought about the reconciliation between the missionaries and the East India Company? This is in context of print.
You see, there was a Charter Act of 1813, which made it possible for, or which sort of gave the company gave itself a mandate to sort of intervene in the educational curricula of the country. That was a Charter Act for about 20 years. I'll give you the exact reference for that, because you see that the pedagogical models and the modern school system in Bengal was something that the missionaries and the company had a common view of, and there they realized that they could not do without the sort of involvement of the missionaries. Let me just give me 1 second before as I pull out the source for this and to give you the exact detail of this. Just a second. Yes, I think here it is. So in 1813, you had just a sec. Yeah, so this was the Charter Act of 1813, which renewed the Charter of East India Company for a further 20 years from British Parliament. Now, it produced two major changes in its attitude towards the colony. One was that the assumption of a kind of responsibility towards native education, and other was a relaxation of control over missionary activity. You see, that was the, I mean, you'll find this in Gauri Vishwanathan's work as well, that this was a kind of a possibility of some kind of truce between the missionaries, that till 1813 missionary activities was not at all tolerated. But the renewing of the license, I'm sure representations must have been made to Parliament about this kind of conflict. So when the charter of the company was renewed for 20 years, this was what was two major features of that. One was this role in native education, one was relaxation of control over missionary. Because by 1813, I mean, some Maharashtra, the Anglo-Maratha War had been won. The British Empire in India had sort of extended, so they could take a slightly more relaxed view of things. I mean, after that, their enemies became the periodical press. In fact, if you first look at pre-1813 period, is the missionaries that they're in conflict with. Post 1813, their chief target of conflict with the company is, in fact, the nascent periodical press run by the Europeans, not so much the Indians, but by white editors. So that was the interesting thing. So the pedagogy. So in 1813, for instance, the first group of schools, missionary schools, are set up in the Chinsur area by the Reverend John May. In 1817, Hindu College is founded in Calcutta. The Calcutta School Book Society is founded. And all of this three factions collaborate. One, the missionaries. Two, the native intelligentsia. Three, the company. So these three constituents get together, and therefore there is this kind of common purpose, we might say, in their work post 1813. Yeah, so I hope that answers the question.
Right. Thank you, sir. The next question is by Dr. Gautam Chaube, who happens to
Hello,
be the.
Gautam.
Yes, I'm sure you know him. So, right.
I have corresponded with him, so very, very excited that he's here.
Right, right. So his question is, did it okay, since few upper caste Hindu households had scriptures in their possession, and also because reading practices were guided by ritualistic codes, how did the locals respond to printed Christian texts? Did it catalyze a conservative turn, or did it embolden them to developing a similar model for disseminating Hindu texts? Gita Press comes much later.
See, that's the one way of addressing this question is not is through a slightly different genre of print. So, for example, I mean, books as such were difficult to print. You needed money, you needed venture capital. What was printed more easily were prints, pictures of gods and gods. You see, this whole idea of calendar art, which would come in later, calendar representation, chromolithographic representation of gods and goddesses, they became, as far as I know, at least in Bengal, a proposition from 1830s onwards, thanks to a printer called Krishna Chandra Karmakar from famous family of type makers, the Karmakar family, who the first two Karmakars, Manohar and Panchanan and Manohar, were type makers in Srirampur. Now, Krishna Chandra set up his own business press, the Chandrodaya press in Srirampur in the 1830s. And he became famous for two things. One is the printing of almanacs, which also plays a very important role in this, in a kind of, the socialization of print, because the almanac, the Hindu almanac or the Muslim almanac, these are all markers of ritualistic practice, as opposed to a more colonial understanding of time. So you're looking at, two different orders of time being sort of dramatized in the pages of the almanac. Now, along with being an almanac printer, which would of course be part of the, which would give you a ritual kind of which would encapsulate all the rituals, he was also printing all these pictures, woodcuts. And the woodcuts went out, and these were very easy to sell. I mean, they were portable. You didn't need much money to do that. So I would suggest, and I don't know much about this, that one of the first ways in which sacred print entered the households was through the medium of the printed picture. If you're looking at upper caste households, they would be familiar with the manuscript form of the sacred text. So some kind of puthi, some kind of palm leaf manuscript, or familiarity with that. I mean, if you look at read Bankim Chandra's novel Chandrasekhar, where Chandrasekhar is such a scholar who has the Sritis and the Puranas and the Shastras. He has manuscripts of all of them, and then he burns them all when his wife is abducted by a British soldier called Lawrence Foster in a kind of a ritual bibliocide. Priya Joshi writes about that in her book, as a kind of a defeat to the new order of knowledge. So that kind of manuscript culture is fairly common. Now, how print and sacred print enters into the lower caste households, or indeed in the more common everyday households, it would perhaps be through the agency of printed pictures, be almanacs. But again, there are very, very, very few records of such consumptions. We know of Krishna Chandra because of certain contemporary accounts, and some of his almanacs, of course, exist. But ownership of almanacs, or ownership of such printed artifacts, and their consumption, is something which we have very little knowledge about, at least as far as Lower Bengal is concerned. Uh, so if that's kind of my response to your question.
Right. Thank you, sir. So the next question again is by a friend of yours. So this is a question by Murali Ranganathan.
Okay.
Hello, this. So this is how he puts it. I'll quote him. Hello, this is Murali Ranganathan. Fantastic lecture. The various models of printing you talked about at the start was very interesting. In Bombay, I find that much of the early printing from 1790s to 1820s was by both Europeans and Indians, and that followed the subscription model. Did that happen in Calcutta?
Yes, certainly. The subscription model was quite common, especially for books of a pious nature. You would need, you would need quite a lot of venture capital for that. One model was subscription, and you would solicit subscriptions beforehand, and then you would print the names of the subscribers. But sometimes there's one instance where the subscriber, well, the publisher writes very pathetically at the end of the book that he had been collecting subscriptions, but then the receipt books had been lost. So because of rain or something, so he was able to reconstruct some of the sort of subscribers from his memory, but the others he has not been able to print. So if people see this book, they should come and claim their copy because we have lost the receipt books. There was all these, but usually that happened, though not for a very long time. I mean, I found a few instances of subscribers, and indeed their names being published. And and the whole point was that this is a good thing which is being done, holy book which is being printed. Why will you not give money? That kind of thing. You must also remember this is the height of Babu, the decadence of Babu culture in Bengal. So how easy it would have been to get money from them for printing of books, I'm not at all sure. They must have had their work cut out. So there are not that many instances of but there are some. I mean, and they're mostly Hindu religious texts of at least 8 or 10 formers, 200 to 400 pages, well produced. So yes, that was certainly a model which I did not mention because, as I said, there are some references to that. Excuse me.
Thank you for answering that question. I just have one observation to make, sir. If you could just share your thoughts on that. In course of the talk, you talked about Chamberlain's travel, and one of the modes in which he travels is, I mean, he takes to the river. He travels by the river. So what I was wondering is, especially in the context of India, I mean, how do we look at book history and in terms of the circulation of books through these riverine routes? Because
That's
that's
a
one
very
of the
good question. You see, that's a very good, because you see there is there is really a kind of watershed, that's the railways, but that is a kind of a slightly false watershed, because you think that 1850s 1860s railways are coming, so it becomes, and to a certain extent it is true that uh, books and also the printing press. Now, if you're transporting a press or materials, it should be you could take it by train, but equally the waterway is actually the choice, the transportation of choice. So I'll give you one example. In 1862, the Shialda station in Calcutta, they started a new railway line called the Mathla Railway. Now, if you read Amitabh Ghosh's Hungry Tide, you will know that a place called Port Canning was set up by the British in the expectation that this would be a kind of a alternative harbor. Now, what they did not budget for was the kind of unpredictability of the river Matla. Matla, actually, the name itself is from Matal, which is like drunk. And it's a completely ungovernable river. So they soon realized that this would not work, and they abandoned that project. But the railway line stood there. I mean, and then it got extended to Diamond Harbor. Now, when that happened in 1862, one of the most interesting things which happened was the preeminent Bengali periodical of the time, newspaper of the time, Shom Prakash, which would come out every Monday. That's Shom Prakash. The editor, Darokanath Vidyabhishon, who actually lived in a village called Changari Pota, which is about, I'm sitting here, it's about 4 railway stations. So if I just walk out of my office, the Jadavpur railway station is behind me. I take a train. The next station is Sonarpur. After that is Subhash Gram. That was Changaripota. It was later called Subhash Gram because Subhash Chandra, it has a Subhash Chandra boat connection. So he lived in Changaripota. And he taught in Fort William College. So he would sometimes he would do a daily commute. He would walk from Subhash Gram to Fort William College. So, and then he started this newspaper called Somprakash in 1858 or 56. And the moment the railways began, he took the press back to his home in the village, which was a wilderness, and tried to improve the village by locating the printing press there. And from every Monday, that preeminent newspaper of its time, Somprakash, went out into all of Bengal. Now from that, so you see, there are certain instances, but equally we know that in Dhaka, where the Brahmo movement was just sort of taking shape, we know where there are accounts of a press taking about 15-20 days, being taken from Calcutta, being put on a boat, and then taken by river to Dhaka. So, and it would make sense to take the riverine route. I mean, trains are still in their infancy. Booking a place on a train, traveling in it, there were a lot of resistance to that. So I think it's very fascinating to see this role of waterways. We do find an account from Chamberlain's travels. I mean, and I've just only read a few of his. I mean, he's constantly traveling by river to the networks of the Hooghly Bhagirathi system, and then the Gangetic Plain, and going to Banaras, going to Allahabad, going to Patna, Munger, all these places, and preaching by the river. So the ghats of the river become this site of encounter. Just as pilgrimages, you're looking at typical sites where all these encounters take place, textual encounters take place. And these are public places. It is the river, it is the market, it is the pilgrimage or the fair. In some cases, even it's the local jail. I mean, literally a captive audience. I mean, go and distribute texts there. And the river is at the heart of it. I mean, without that, it wouldn't have been possible for the missionaries to go out to northern India. But then again, this was a fraught project. When they went to the southeast, the part of the missionary project was also to go to Burma. They took the first printing press which was sent to Burma sank in the river Irrawaddy. The missionaries barely escaped with their lives. Entire printing press sank. So the once you get out into the Bay of Bengal, it's not that easy anymore. So there are very interesting stories could be told about through a riverine perspective, but again, we need the materials for that storytelling, and you have to really search far and wide for that kind of chance, an anecdote about waterways, or a kind of press sinking in the river, the accidents, and so on and so forth.
Thank you so much, sir, for answering not just this, but all the questions patiently, and only adding to the richness of your talk. Thank you so much for the talk. And I would like to thank our audience who joined us today, who were there with us all throughout, and for those who also asked important questions. Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much.